the film angle
to the Cinebois.
This is our Halloween special.
This is the film angle.
Welcome to The Film Angle, a podcast where we dive deep into the latest releases and unearth the classics to better our cinephilic curiosity. I'm Alex.
And I'm Chris.
I'm Ben.
I'm Danny.
Let's get into it. That's right. We would like to welcome to the podcast the Cinebois2Cinemen, their long-awaited, debut on the Film Angle podcast. How you doing, guys?
Good, thank you. Yeah, very good.
Very well. Thank you for having us. I've been looking forward to this for a long old time, so it's good to finally get stuck in.
How long?
Months.
I did look, and I couldn't believe that February was when we did our crossover episode
really?
on your guys' podcast, which I felt like it wasn't that long ago.
Yeah,
but that's like start of the year, and here we are at the end of the year. So we're just really rubbish at like returning the invitation. It seems.
No, all good. Yeah, was it February? Was it?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Then again, we turned it around pretty fast, I think. So
I won't worry too much. We're rubbish at recording our own podcast. So.
yeah.
You guys have been pretty consistent lately.
Yeah, you have been good.
We keep saying next week, and then it never is. Next week. Wow. Give or take. I kind of like that. I think it's sort of. It's like unexpected. You know?
Yeah. You're just returning home, and you're like, "Oh, there's an episode of Cinebois2Cinemen to stick on. I'll get around to that later."
Yeah, you don't know. You don't know when the blue dot will come up on Spotify. You just don't know. It's a mystery. That's what we're all about.
Some of our audience may have listened to the crossover back earlier in the year, but if you haven't, our audience don't know who you are potentially. I know there's a lot of crossover because we're all friends here, but when we do ask people to come on, we ask them to give us like 4 films to get to know them. But we thought since this was the Halloween special and there's 2 of you, so we thought maybe not 4, we'll do 3. If you were each to bring 3 kind of horror films, Halloween, spooky films, whatever, themed around this time of year, for our audience to better know your kind of tastes for this part of the year, which is very difficult to describe, because when you say Halloween film, you don't want people to think I'm talking specifically about the film franchise Halloween.
Yeah.
But then like horror films aren't always Halloween films, but that kind of spooky thing, that's what I'm kind of thinking.
Mm.
So my first film is a film we're all very familiar with, I'm sure. And it's come back into my life reasonably recently because someone I know said it was shit. And I was like struck by just how gutted I was and just how wrong I thought they were. I'm seeing them this weekend, actually, and I'm going to bring it up, I think, because I can't let it go. And I keep saying to my wife, Hannah, who's like, that's kind of how I know her, is through Hannah. It's just like, I can't believe she didn't like this film. She has her reasons, but I disagree with those reasons.
None of them are acceptable by the sounds of it.
No, it just really bothers me. And it also made me realise how much I love it and how like dear I kind of hold this film quite close.
I'm really excited.
Yeah, I should probably just say what it is now. The film is Shaun of the Dead.
Wait, who said Shaun of the Dead was bad? Hannah said Shaun of the Dead. No. Her friend. I won't name and shame her, although you know it's a woman, so that's 50% of the population gone. But and it was just like we watched it together last year, and it just reminded me of how excellent I thought the screenplay was, and how
how many times I watched it in a row. It was like one of the first DVDs I got. And also just like how much I kind of broadly agree with the themes aren't the sort of forefront of that. It's largely about the comedy, and also the kind of gore is what I remember it for. But it has so much heart, and I think it's easy to forget that film, out of Edgar Wright's sort of filmography, has just so much. There's so much kind of like, I guess it's just also genuine. And it says there's a lot about male friendships in there, and what happens as you kind of age. And it just sort of like, every time you put it on, it kind of speaks to you in a slightly different way, especially as you kind of hit your 30s. It kind of might ring true for some people. And the criticism that was leveled at it was that it was a kind of boys film about boys. And it wasn't, and the female characters were kind of underdeveloped, which I kind of understand, where, that is a just criticism, as any criticism is. But I kind of actually think that, although yes, it might be slightly guilty of veering more towards the kind of male characters, and I just sort of think that it is also a big critique about male behavior as well, and like what you do when you don't grow up, and what you need to do in order to grow up. Yeah. And it kind of, there's a kind of culmination at the end where it's like he just said he has to say goodbye to his best friend, and he has to kind of move forward with his, and kind of take his relationship more seriously. And obviously there's a whole kind of zombie thing going on in the background, which I just love. And it sort of fits in so well, and it has no business being that good, because it makes no sense that there's a zombie apocalypse happening. But somehow the themes tie into that, and how he reacts to it as an adult for the first time. I just think that that anyone who criticizes it is wrong. And no, it just kind of, for me, it was like a very sort of formative viewing, and it was one of the first times I'd really seen some horrible, gory moments as well. And so there's a definite sort of formative side of this to me, and that's why I think it sort of would describe me quite well. If my personality were to be 3 films, this would certainly be one of them, for sure.
Yeah. That's an awesome pick, Ben, because me and my partner Lauren watched it several weeks ago, rewatched it, and it is such an interesting rewatch, because like you, it was a very formative film for me, where when we were kids, it was like a sleepover movie for us.
Yeah.
And it's funny because for a film that's so heavy on referencing horror films of the past and leaning into those pastiches, it somehow works for people who've never seen a horror movie before. You can be completely on board and love the movie just as much, even if you've got no exposure to what it's riffing on. But yeah, as a rewatch, it's like all those things about friendships and tying yourself too much to your childish past kind of like really come to the forefront. So yeah, it's like a movie that just keeps on giving, and it helps that it's funny as hell and so enthusiastic and creative. And yeah, Edgar Wright, man, so good.
There's a line from it which is possibly one of my favorite lines of all time. And it goes like this, and it might not be what you're expecting, but it's I always love you, Sean. I always knew you had it in you to do well. You just needed motivation, someone you could look up to, and I thought it could be me. And just take care of your mum. And it's like, fuck, this is in like a comedy horror film. That line exists comfortably in a comedy horror context.
Yeah.
And it just sort of, everything just stops for a moment, and that line happens, and it's just like a really beautiful line, kind of really expertly said. It's just Bill Nye's line, and he says it so well, and it's also genuine. And it kind of, and the way it segues away from that emotional moment is a really funny moment as well. Like, Mum, he's dead. No, he isn't. It's just like, there's something about that moment which, again, I think it needs to be studied a bit, because it's just like such a well-written script that fits snugly into this kind of very, you could say it's a spoof film. I don't think it is, but like, it's called Shaun of the Dead. I just wanted to sort of remind everyone who's listening of that line, really, as well.
I do remember thinking it was very much like a parody film when I first, put it in, and I was like, oh, here we go. This is like those other films I've seen, because there were a lot of parody films around that time.
Yeah.
Scary movies and stuff like that. And Shaun of the Dead really is not, and it is surprisingly funny and full of heart. And like, you're right, it is just like the best of that kind of like, I guess, horror comedies, of which there's been a few try to kind of take that spark that Edgar Wright had, but I don't think any of them kind of like are nearly as good as Shaun of the Dead. So.
No, yeah, I think the horror is horrific and the comedy is hilarious. It's the American Werewolf in London thing, and I think I think it's the thing about the Hot Fuzz is it's really quotable and it's really enjoyable, but it does lack the heart a bit. I think the heart gets lost in the fact that I just don't think they cared about action films as much as they cared about horror films.
Yeah,
it's still fantastic, and like I would quote that film to the ends of the earth. But sure, yeah, again, I agree with you that it's out of all of the three, or more broadly in all of his filmography, it's 100% like hands down the best one by a country mile, I think. Everything just works. It's like Fellowship of the Ring. Everything just sort of works. You can't level a criticism at it, and anyone who does is wrong.
It's funny because I tend to take issue with this sort of very common theme in a lot of films, particularly like romantic comedies, where like Knocked Up, for example, is the film that comes to mind. But the sort of the plot focuses on a person growing up. And the whole idea that underpins growing up is getting a job and like falling rank and file with everyone else and all that kind of stuff. And I actually find that a little bit grating as a theme, because I'm not so sure that growing up is so dependent on things like that necessarily. I don't know what that says about me, but no. But you know what I mean? Like, and I think what I like so much about Shaun of the Dead is that it grounds it in a more sort of earnest sort of realism, that it isn't just about getting a job and accepting that you're not going to get everything your own way, but it's also about just being slightly better and being there for people. And
it's by compromise.
Yeah. Whereas I think some films lean so much into this idea that the only way to improve yourself is to sort of surrender your individuality and get a job and all that kind of stuff, which I don't know, maybe I sort of like zero in on that as a theme in like subpar American romantic comedies, but I find it really grating thematically, because I don't think it necessarily shows the best message. But I think in Shaun of the Dead it's really well done, and it's, as I said, so earnest and sweet, and it's so well performed by, like you say, being Bill Nye doesn't really get much of a mention in that context in regard to the film in terms of performances. But thinking about it in that way definitely gives the film, alongside like its sort of brilliant script and its physical comedy, which I think is Edgar Wright's bag really as a director. I think the way he utilizes the camera, it's not physical in the sense like the sort of Chaplin comedy physical sense, but the way the camera is almost in on the gag. I think he's sort of, in terms of more modern directors, certainly mainstream modern directors, he's one of the best for that, isn't he? Really?
Yeah, definitely. He knows that, like, you can make a joke with the camera as well as like what people are saying at the same time, and that is kind of like one of those special traits. And I think, there are so many comedies which, like you mentioned, Knocked Up. I do think that those kind of films. It is Adam McKay, isn't it, who did Knocked Up?
It's Judd Apatow.
But
it's a similar vibe.
They're all around there, aren't they?
Yeah, it's kind of like leave the camera there, let the actors do the improv, and just kind of go. And like that works for some of the films, but other times it's just like, it's quite a stale film, and the comedy all comes from, I guess, dialogue and performance instead. Whereas with Edgar Wright films, it seems to be like an all-rounder, like everything can be funny, sound, camera, performance, the whole thing, which is like something that not a lot of comedy films seem to use.
Great pick, Ben. Danny, what's your first film?
So I was one of the great things about going on another podcast is I can talk about films that I talk about a lot on our podcast, and I've started to like stop myself from doing it because I just think the few people that listen are getting bored of me talking about the same films over and over again. But because we're on here, I'm going to talk about a film that I talk about quite a lot. And that's...
Oh, thank you very much for that.
Sorry, I didn't mean it like that, but different audience, so they might not have heard me wax lyrical about the same films. But the film I picked was Life Force. Tobe Hooper's Life Force. I guess it... when we were sort of me and Ben were talking beforehand about picking films that say a lot about us, it's always a bit weird within the context of the horror genre because you feel like you might come across like a real weirdo. So that sort of factored heavily into my decision. But one of the reasons I picked it in terms of my own sort of relationship with film, I guess, is that I'm always sort of really interested in the relationship between the sort of the history, or like history more broadly, and the films that are made at the same time. So the relationship between sort of events and the culture that is born from those events. And I think, Life Force is interesting, not necessarily in that sense, but more the production company that behind it, and Cannon Films, who again is something we talk about quite a lot on our podcast. But they were sort of famous for not only making lots of like morally reprehensible, very sort of, I mean, I don't know about everyone's political beliefs here, but I imagine they're not in line with
depravity.
They're not in line with Cannon's sort of like very nationalist outlook that was there basically to stoke, feelings of American pride, etc., etc. But they also made a lot of films, like a lot of B-movie studios. They made a lot of movies that kind of reflected the dominant, I guess, like genre or themes or styles that were pursued at the time by sort of more highbrow,
Sure.
Yeah, more sort of industry standard filmmakers and studios, like, Spielberg's and Alien with Ridley Scott. And, what I like so much about Life Force in this context is that I think it's the best film they did in the sense that it apes the dominant sci-fi films of the time or the horror films of the time. I think it does such a good job of doing it, even though it's so blatantly obvious that it's sort of like mugging off films like Alien and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But it's doing it through the lens of Cannon, which I personally think is wonderful. And and also the sort of link, I guess, between the sort of lowbrow, quote unquote, and the highbrow films like Alien is that Dan O'Bannon, who wrote Alien, also co-wrote Life Force. So there's something in that as well. But I just think that when Tobe Hooper comes along, he adds like a sort of, we all know he's like the master of quite nasty, dirty sort of horror movies. And he's also like really good at working with locations, both exterior and interior, in terms of, sets,
oh, definitely. Yeah.
And this film showcases his sort of directing chops in like quite ambitious set design. And it's such a beautifully made film, even though like, I think the opening is like so reminiscent of Alien, like it is a borderline ripoff.
No, but then I see, like, I haven't seen the film myself, Danny, but then I read things in the synopsis like, malevolent race of space vampires.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound grounded like Alien.
No,
to me.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So that's what Cannon do, though, is that they take these sort of like very lofty, critically acclaimed films and the ideas within them, and then distort them for like a mass market appeal. And they also siphon it through the lens of Cannon, which was, run by two very eccentric characters who made no scruples about like ripping things off or saving as much money as possible or whatever. I mean, although for a long time they threw a lot of money at the wrong projects. That's sort of why they went bust in the end. But, I think that's sort of the charm of it, is that on the one hand, it is definitely riding on the coattails of those films, the more prestigious films, but it finds its sort of own ground in the terms of, with the inclusion of space vampires. And it's also got like a sense of humor to it, which is central to Hooper as well as a filmmaker. I don't think enough people acknowledge that about him. Like, he directed Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which I believe is also Cannon Films. And that's a really funny movie. And he also, I rewatched for the first time in years, Poltergeist last night. And that's an excellent film. And funny enough, when we talk about Spielberg, obviously Spielberg and Hooper were pretty almost like interlinked throughout that entire the making of that film.
Yeah.
But like he does, and that film is really funny. Like there is a real sense of humor, but it's not overt in the sense it's like laugh, ha ha. It's like more in the satirical elements. And this film just sort of seems like a big fuck you to like big studio filmmaking, in the sense that it takes the ideas of other movies and just distorts it into something absolutely mental. Plus, you get Patrick Stewart in it as well, which is always a win. So,
yes,
I haven't told you now.
Is he one of the vampires?
No,
I've always wanted to see Life Force.
It's great.
It is very funny, very good. Yeah,
it's great.
Yeah. I did this week watch a Tobe Hooper film in anticipation that it might be one of your picks, and it still might be, Danny, because I know how much you love the film. But this was not the one I did, and I'm regretting it right now.
Oh no, yeah. The thing is, I did toy with the idea of Texas Chainsaw Massacre a lot because I'm assuming that's I know I toyed with it because that's one of my all-time favorite films, and also obviously one of my favorite horror films. But I just thought it'd be nice to veer off into some of his other films because his career as a director is so interesting and so varied, even though he worked pretty exclusively in the horror genre. But like, he did move away from that style of filmmaking in his career, and with Cannon, that's the kind of films he made, and they're just, I think Life Force is definitely, well, alongside Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which I think is an excellent sequel.
Yeah, I've only seen the first one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, mate, two is
good.
Very different, but very good. Yeah.
It borrows from the sort of alien school of thought, and I think I say this quite a lot, but James Cameron said when he got the job for Alien, there's no point in me making Alien. I can't make another Alien, but I can do action, so I'm going to make Aliens. So I think Tobe Hooper was like, well, I can't really make that again because that film was like, a product of the limitations that were on him as a creative, as a filmmaker with budget and all that kind of stuff. So to try and replicate that would be cheap and a bit naff, I think. So he thinks, I'm just going to make a balls to the wall, crazy family comedy with Dennis Hopper and chainsaw fights. So I think
chainsaw.
Dennis Hopper's
he is, and
well, that's an instant because he brings a crazy Denny sort of film out. Yeah, it needs to be seen.
He fucking delivers. Okay. But no, I would implore anyone to see Life Force. A lot of people seem to malign it, and sorry, I'm conscious I'm sort of banging on, but like I think it's
stop banging on.
Stop banging on,
please.
I think a lot of people with 80s films, and I'm only talking, this is very experiential for me, so I'm not sure if this is necessarily fair, but whenever I watch 80s films with some people, they think that they figured it out when they just think 80s films are cheesy. So they're really dismissive about them. And I think a lot of people do this in particular with Life Force because it is very cheesy and quite silly at points. But I would just implore anyone that watches this film and any of Tobe Hooper's sort of later films to not have that attitude and go in with sort of the blinkers on, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. Poltergeist is so good. I mean, I watched that. The last time I watched Poltergeist, Danny, was in 4DX.
Oh, wow.
That was surprisingly an effective experience.
I can imagine.
A way to watch that movie.
Yeah.
Strobe lights galore. But like you're so right. I love the way Poltergeist does exactly that same thing, where that movie is both an interior and exterior film. Like it feels like we're outside just as much as we're inside, and it manages to create such like a world around 300 square feet of land. And I really want to see Life Force for that reason, because like what I have seen of Tobe Hooper like have become top tier horror films.
The man's, I mean, I think me and you, Ben, were talking about this a while ago. I said I'm unafraid to say he's probably like one of my favorite directors. I just think he's so good. And I particularly sort of veering off from Life Force into Poltergeist, but like, because it's so fresh in the mind. But what I particularly like about Poltergeist is that it's like Spielberg's view of suburbia, which you see in things like E.T., meets the sort of nasty edge of Tobe Hooper. And I think that battle between those two creative forces, those titans, I mean, you could argue Spielberg's probably the bigger of the two, but I just find that sort of like the tension within those two sort of stylistic and thematic influences really actually makes the film better. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
You said Titans, and I'm just picturing like a giant Godzilla-sized Spielberg fighting Tobe Hooper now in the middle of the stage.
Shirtless.
Preferably not.
Another good Toe Pooper project to watch, actually, and this is relevant now because there's a remake coming out, Salem's Lot, which is a TV movie. And it's really good. It's like peak Toe Pooper, in my opinion.
Okay.
I remember there's a couple of moments in it which are genuinely skin-crawlingly terrifying. He's back with with vampires again. I think it was made after Life Force.
Life Force is 85.
I think Salem's Lot might have been later.
Oh, wow, okay.
I'm seeing here it was 79.
Oh, maybe I'm wrong then.
So a bit earlier.
Yeah, I've not seen it. I bought it on Blu-ray. Funnily enough, I think after your recommendation.
Yeah, it's 99, yeah.
It's just excellent, very atmospheric, very playful. I won't talk about it too much because it's not one of my picks, but it is just one of the lesser known ones, really.
Playful is a really good term, actually, to describe him as a filmmaker. Like, he's nasty. Some of his films are pretty. There's a film, Eaten Alive, which is all shot on a soundstage, but that's like another sort of foray into, like Hidden America, and it's not doesn't paint a particularly pretty picture of the population of the bayou. They've sort of had the rough with the smooth, really, in general, cinematically, with like Deliverance.
Yeah,
but
it's like a Red Dead Redemption side quest.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, culturally, I think. Although they do fare well in John Woo's Hard Target, starring a fledgling Jean-Claude Van Damme. Oh, I've lost my point now. I'm just thinking about Jean-Claude Van Damme's mullet. Oh yeah, like his films can sometimes, Hooper's films can sometimes stray into. They can be a bit nasty sometimes, perhaps a little bit too much, and I'm all for it. But I could definitely see why people would have, sort of thematic reservations towards some of his films with violence and maybe the portrayals of women. I think, but valid criticisms. But I think he does have actually a real sense of playfulness as well within that, which I'm not. Yeah, for me, he gets off with everything else as a result.
Let him off. Let him off.
I'm perfectly placed to let him off, obviously. But
a great pick, and actually been on my list for a long time. So that's just pushing it further and further up now. So I really do need to get around to Life Force because I think you've probably told me before, Danny, and I think I've had a few other people tell me that I would really like.
Yeah, definitely.
I need to get on it. Ben, what is your second spooky film to get to know you?
Spooky.
Sure, yeah. Before I talk about that, I just want to. Maybe I was a bit harsh on Hannah's friend in the previous one. on reflection, I feel like maybe I should apologise because she did have a good point to make.
Nah, mate, double down.
I just can't stop thinking about it.
I don't know anybody who dislikes Shaun of the Dead, and I know a lot of people who love it. So
yeah. It was just odd to me. I was like, and we watched it together, and I thought everyone loved it, and it wasn't the case.
You should play this episode at the gathering.
Yeah, I might do. I might just fast forward to these moments. Yeah. Anyway, so my second one is it was in and out of the list for a little while, and ultimately I chose it because it kind of. For me, I love like folk tales. Like I really love folklore, and not in the kind of, I guess you could call it like LARPing mentality. More, do you know what I mean? Like you can get when people say folklore, you can think like kind of high fantasy, but I mean that kind of ghost stories. Like really
cautionary tales.
Yeah, that kind of thing, And I actually think that, like, kind of, Charles Dickens' ghost stories, Henry James's ghost stories they kind of transitioned into folk tales now a little bit, I think, because they kind of exist in an era which we are very, very, unfamiliar with, and the stories have stood the test of time. So my film is called The Innocents, not innocence as in a CE at the end, as in TS, so a plural. But it's an adaptation of The Turn of the Screw, the Henry James short horror story, and it's from like the early 60s. And I watched it at a cinema, which is like in an Oast house. It was a really unusual. It was like my granddad's friend had a cinema next to a cattery, right? And it was just a really strange way of watching it, but they all met up. It was like a little film club, and I got taken to one of them, and they put this film on, and it was like, the reason why I found it so bone-chillingly scary was partially because it was black and white and made in the 60s. I think, it's sometimes that can kind of work against a film, particularly if you want a modern audience as a whole to enjoy it. Like the fact that it was made a long time ago can kind of inhibit the kind of this sort of repeat viewership and introducing it to new people. But in this case, it actually really made it better. It was just like a really great, straightforward, very faithful adaptation of the story, which focuses mainly on this Deborah Kerr. She plays, I can't remember her name in the film, but she plays like a housekeeper that gets brought on. It's a very sort of traditional ghost story, really. And she meets the children who are kind of broadly very sweet and very innocent, right? But then you sort of realize, especially with the boy, that he's kind of, there's something not all is not well with him, and he is kind of being semi-inhabited, and it sounds like a possession story, but it really isn't. It is just like a kind of ghost story from the Victorian era, and it just works so well, and it has this menace about it that isn't as a result of music or performance, but just the look of it, and the kind of, there's like a very famous visual effect in it, which is really straightforward. Just like they actually use it to fake ghost pictures. It's like double exposure, but they use that in the film, and it really works fantastic, in a fantastic way. And I just love those stories, and I think what the act of watching the film is like getting told it around a campfire or in the dark. Like the act of watching it is like, it's very isolating, and that's what you want with a horror film, I think. And there's a kind of menace and an eeriness that is really hard to replicate, especially with horror films today. Like sometimes it's just easier to maybe leave that behind in favor of jump scares, and this is just the opposite of that. So I've talked for ages about The Innocents already.
Ben, is the film with Nicole Kidman, The Others, is that like a spiritual remake of this? Like, I'm picturing, I can see the poster for The Innocents right now, her holding the candlesticks, and I'm thinking of like that poster for The Others, and it just seems very similar. Like the tone of those movies seem quite similar too. I remember really liking that movie.
Oh man, yeah. Do you know what? The Others was actually on my potential picks for this list. Yeah,
that's straightforward as well, and like quite.
I love that film as well. I think it's fantastic. It isn't an adaptation of the same story, but I'd be very surprised if it wasn't liberally borrowing from it. But that's a great film as well, and that nearly made the list. I chose this one because, again, there's a kind of the setting that I watched it was kind of quite unique to me, and it just speaks. I think it does a slightly better job of adapting that getting sat down and told a ghost story kind of feeling. But you're right; it is very similar. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. I've not seen that one. But it looks like, just from like looking it up on Letterboxd as you were chatting about it, I was like, yeah, this seems really interesting, and I want to watch it. Has anybody else seen it?
No, I've not seen it.
No.
It's
good,
not
very aware of it.
But yeah. It's just, I mean, that story has been adapted a fair few times. More recently, Netflix did The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is an adaptation of the.
Which I'm sure is much better than the original. Yeah, in every way.
It's Mike Flanagan. I mean, to be fair, I didn't hate it, but the Innocents is like up there big time for me.
Sure.
And watch it. I think I'm fairly sure it's on. It might have a Blu-ray transfer, actually. I haven't
colour me intrigued.
Add it to the collection.
Exactly. Yeah.
Definitely.
For anybody who doesn't know, Danny has the most extensive collection of films I've ever seen. Anyway,
collector's edition Blu-ray. So.
Who doesn't want 4 or 5 bookcases worth?
I know. Even for me, like, I love it, and I look at it and go, "Oh, that's." I sort of, sort of oscillate between being proud of it and ashamed. But it is pretty. Yeah, I'm pretty pleased with it.
If you sold that entire collection, you would instantly be like thrown into the top 10 most wealthy men in the
UK. Conversely, though, if I'd not spent the money on it, I'd probably be the top 10.
Oh, yeah, there is that.
I just wanted to say, actually, Ben, I really like that idea of you saying about these sort of classic ghost stories, like these sort of Charles Dickens as The Signalman is the one that first came to mind for me. I read that fairly recently and it was excellent. But
I love that story. Yeah.
I like the idea that they've almost become folkloric, you know, because I think in an increasingly modern world where, you know, there's not as much mystery in anything, you know, and everything is I don't know, it's becoming quite sterile, and it's quite nice to be able to retreat to that sort of considerably more, not archaic, but more old-fashioned approach to sort of storytelling. And I really like that. I haven't seen that film, but I think a lot of the Ealing Studios sort of horrors, the ghost films, and they channel that spirit of those films super well. The source material, the Henry James and the Dickens novels, really, really well, in the sense that they do feel like these little sort of relics of a bygone time. I just thought it was a really interesting point there, Ben.
I think there is something as well with like an older horror film where it's kind of like the audiences at the time might have been more partial to like believing in the ghost story than we are as a modern audience. So you don't know which way the film's going to go. So you might be watching a more modern ghost film and, you know, it all turns out to be fake because, you know, there is I would say like the majority of the human race doesn't believe in ghosts. So that may be a generalization. But I think back then it was more up in the air in terms of beliefs around these kinds of things.
Yeah. No, I do. I agree. I think there's a place in today's society for those stories. And it's a shame that they don't get adapted more often. I would absolutely love to see an adaptation of The Signalman, actually, because that is also, I mean, along with the kind of elemental terror that you get with these stories, you also have there's something about railway tunnels which are just fucking terrifying.
Was there a BBC adaptation? Yeah,
yes, there was. Yes, it is good. Yeah, it's black and white, very grainy. The sound's a bit, you know, when the sound's a bit naff and it contributes to that atmosphere. It's got that about it. I think it was a television adaptation. But yeah, there's just that kind of story had to make my list because of that vibe.
That's great.
Added to the watch list.
Please do.
Danny, what about your second film?
So my second film is Bride of Frankenstein.
Okay.
I was funny because I was like I was going through my letterbox and all the more recent horrors I'd watched because it was just there for my memory to talk about films I've seen more recently. But I absolutely adore the Universal Monsters horror films, obviously the early ones from the 30s. And I think that Bride of Frankenstein for me is the best one. And you know, for lots of reasons, but I think broadly, I do sort of feel that era of horror films, even though they're very iconic, and obviously, you know, it kind of all started there as far as like, you know, Western, well, not maybe Western, but certainly like, you know, Hollywood horror films really started to flourish in the sort of pre-Hays Code era, then into, you know, then that sort of morphed into like Atomic era horror films and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, I do think that because particularly Universal horror films, you know, the trajectory ended up becoming kind of like more schlocky sort of Hammer horror stuff. And don't be wrong, there's some great Hammer horror stuff, like
your Vincent Price's,
exactly,
that sort of stuff.
But there's a schlockiness to it, which is obviously essential to the enjoyment of Hammer horror. But I think maybe it's sort of somewhat undermined the genuine like sort of brilliance of the Universal monster films beforehand. You know, the 30s ones, and the reason I picked, because it was close for me between that. The first Frankenstein and the Invisible Man. But I went for this one because I just think the director James Whale, as far as I'm concerned anyway, I think he captures the sort of like the thematic intention of Mary Shelley's novel best, certainly better than any other. Maybe Kenneth Branagh does pretty good with his version. I quite like that one, but I love this one so much because it just feels so, you know, the sort of heartbreaking nature of the film really comes through, or the nature of Frankenstein's sort of failed quest for humanity. and it sort of conveys this idea that humanity, which it should be, but isn't, like it isn't a God-given right. You sort of earn humanity on the basis of who you are, who you're born into, what values you hold, the rules of the land or the environment that you're born into, and that often affords you like a humanity and a worth. And Frankenstein, by the very nature, obviously, of his appearance and who he is and what he's the sort of, what he's the byproduct of, instantly puts him at odds with the kind of society that, on the one hand, would profess to have a sort of a good, clear conscience, but when it's actually tested, it immediately sort of crumbles in place of this sort of like barbaric and sort of really sort of horrible sort of behavior that obviously ultimately, the Frankenstein experiences firsthand. But I just think that, James Whale doesn't get enough credit as a monster film director. Obviously, think of like Ishihiro Honda for Godzilla. Like I'd put him right alongside him, because I just think he really captures the essence of what a great horror movie is. It's not just about spectacle; it's actually about like the thematic stuff behind it.
Even though that stuff is still there too, like there's
100%,
yeah.
And the special effects in Bride of Frankenstein, I'm always baffled by like the small people in the little.
That's amazing. Yeah,
I can't understand how they did that. Like that absolutely baffles me. For like, was it like 1935? It's just like insane special effects. Not that should be the only thing that's great about the film, but that special effect always gets me every time. I'm just like, how are you 100%. Doing this?
It ties directly into what Ben was saying about like the whole campfire story element, and what the way that James Whale sort of updates himself in the first film by actually bookending Bride of Frankenstein with Mary Shelley actually introducing the film and the story. The concept of this book is a really great way to kind of like just kind of set up this film, and it really leans into that Victorian aesthetic really well.
100%. You're right. That bit, I remember when that film first started, and it starts with that. I remember thinking, God, that's a really bizarre choice to start with, sort of, especially as it's a sequel. Like, you're sort of in the sequel, you're starting with Mary Shelley. Who's she with? Is it Byron? I want to say Lord Byron. I know she got held up in real life. She got held up in a castle, didn't she? During was it like a volcano ash or something? Was all going all over Europe.
Krakatoa.
I know that
maybe it was the right era. It wouldn't surprise me, and she did lock horns with Byron. Not lock horns, but
not that way.
They were around at the same time.
Although Lord Byron, you wouldn't put it past.
I think it might have been.
But no, like, but
his good sister.
True. Sorry, Mary, I'm busy. But I don't know, like there was some kind of like real like natural event, and she was holed up in this house, and it apparently like had a real impact on where she was staying. I can't remember where she was at the time. I should really have researched this, but and the film even captures that really well. It feels like, I don't know, like,
isn't it like some castle? Like they zoom in from it's almost like a Disney film where it starts from the outside, the exterior, and then it transports us into the sitting room via the stained glass window. It's it's super gothic. It's great. It's really cool.
It's funny because obviously the stylistic tropes that we have just become so used to with horror films, they kind of started with the literature, but the sort of, in terms of film, it starts with those guys, right? It starts with James Whale and the Frankenstein films, and obviously the other sort of Universal monster films of that time. But it is such an atmosphere. I would love to see it on the big screen. It's like a bizarrely quite a comforting atmosphere for me. I don't know, like, and that's kind of like horror films more broadly for me in a way. Like there is something quite sort of comforting about them, especially at this time of year. But yeah, I don't know. I just love it.
I love all those like early Universal horror films. We started when we first started the podcast. We didn't intentionally make it a series, but we kind of like did review a few of the early ones. And obviously,
we did the Mummy and the Invisible Man as well, and
and James Whale's behind the Invisible Man as well, and that one is just like a really, really great film. I love the Invisible Man. So those films are like short and sweet, and horrible and just like entertaining and great all at the same time. They really are just like a little magic moment in time.
That's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, definitely.
I just want to say quickly, sorry, I got my Indonesian volcanoes mixed up.
Another apology.
Yeah, it was Mount Tambora, not Krakatoa. But yeah, apart from that, it was.
That's 2 strikes now, Ben. Yeah. You're on thin ice, buddy.
Our podcast is littered with this. Did we? I remember we did an episode about war films, and didn't we we got MASH? MASH was a Vietnam War film, but it wasn't. It was the Korea War. And that is,
it's Korean War.
There's quite a lot of time between those two conflicts. So embarrassing.
It was my mum that pointed it out ultimately as well. And
Mummy,
just
as if you could go back and do anything about it.
We did record some little sound bites of you going Korean War. I don't know if I ever made it. I don't know if I ever managed
to retcon it. Yeah. Just me going. It's like that film MASH that was made set during the Korean War. Just like totally off.
I know there was some times where we did that, or like with character names, and we tried to re-record a few little snippets of us just saying like a different character name, but you can never get it quite right. No. You can never something about when you record. That's it. It's like it's
better just doing the whole sentence again. I don't know why we did that.
We did the same thing as well with Babylon. We thought Kim Cattrall was in it, and she wasn't.
Yes. Yeah. Kim, yeah. I think we actually did. I actually did manage to splice that in, and it was like just on the cusp of acceptable. But yeah, you spent the whole podcast saying Kim.
I don't know what I was doing.
I think it was someone reasonably similar. Maybe it was another one of the Sex of the City women, and we just got mixed up. I'm not sure.
Well, there's so many people in that movie, though. You can kind of get away with saying something like that. People will be like, "Oh yeah, sure, I'm sure she was in that film, whatever."
Yeah, lots of people have their fun.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
She was in it.
We're too busy being bewitched by our incisive film criticism to acknowledge the clear flaws.
Nice one. Ben, what is your final film on the list?
Okay. It's a pretty typical answer. I think it's a lot of people's favorite horror film. It's The Shining.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah.
I had to go with it because not only is it widely regarded as one of the best horror films ever made by some, it's also one of the first 18s I ever saw. So again, there's a formative element to all of my picks, not exclusively. That's not the only reason I've picked them, but because I think it holds up. The Shining holds up in a variety of ways. But it was also one of those films where I was allowed to watch it like pretty young, but I wasn't allowed to watch 2 of the scenes in it. One was because they were too frightening.
The guy getting sucked off a bed by a teddy bear?
That was, I think that last section of the film was omitted, was censored by my dear parents.
How did they do that? Did they just sort of speed through it? But that would just be really quick.
They said, Ben, look away, and when the blood comes out of the elevator, you can watch it again. Because that signifies the end of that period of the film. And also the woman in the bathtub. It was only when she turns into the horrible woman with leprosy that I had to look away. Before it was all okay. I think the build-up was still sort of, they wanted me to watch the build-up for some reason. I think it was just like that horrible that kind of horrible elemental side of it. And then once she gets out of the bath, it was like, yeah, look away now, obviously. For not just because of the horror element, obviously there's the kind of like nudity element as well, I suppose. But anyway, sorry, that's a big
Were they just
story
like
about that.
Desperately wanting you to, like, they were like, we got to show this guy The Shining, like,
yeah,
got to see The Shining, but like there are bits of it we'd be bad parents if we
I think it was one of those where you're just like, he has to see it because I think they talked about it a lot, and I got very, very interested in the idea. And I loved the Simpsons episode where the Treehouse of Horror as well. And like they were like, well, he has to know what that
shinning
reference is. The shinning, yeah.
Your parents are so cool, man. Honestly, that's a cool thing.
Yeah, in terms of like, just definitely in terms of like the kind of content's the wrong word really. The films that they let me watch is just like they were very selective. But I've talked about this before. But and so The Shining. I watch it probably about once a year on average. It's just like it's just great. It's so the soundtrack in it is so kind of like there's so many drones in it, and like
it's so over the top, but it works, yeah.
It's punctuated by these kind of weird screams, especially at the beginning. Obviously, Jack Nicholson. It strips the novel down as well, like Jack Nicholson's performance. I like that he's always mad. I quite like that about the film, because obviously I think one of the things Stephen King hated about Stanley Kubrick's adaptation is that Jack Torrance is seemingly insane from the beginning. Yeah. But I love that. Yeah. I kind of like that about him, is that he's already dissatisfied with his family life to the extent where he's kind of already thinking about murdering them.
You can almost like never pinpoint the moment the insanity begins. I think as actually, you get a hint of it at the start, but you never can tell the moment where he turns completely mad. I think that makes it really scary. But right.
That performance contributes so much to the general atmosphere in that film of that. Like, I mean, just the idea of being stuck in a hotel throughout the winter. I've never actually been to Colorado, but the sort of sense of isolation and the atmosphere. You can probably tell by now that I absolutely love atmospheric horror films. But it just, I mean, it's a pretty obvious pick, but
Shelley Duvall is so amazing in that movie too.
Yeah, she's great. They're all really good. Even it's Danny Lloyd, I think he's called, the boy in it, who's now a geography teacher or something, or like a vet, or I can't remember. It's one of those.
A geography vet.
A lot of them become vets.
I can't remember what it's just like
the kid from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory become a vet. That's
right. Peter Ostrom. Yeah. Maybe it's
to escape.
It's like a biology teacher,
like
or something.
Every human would recognise it, but a dog wouldn't. Especially if he's putting it down. I mean, hang on a minute, aren't you Charlie in the gut?
Shoves a golden ticket in its mouth. Yeah.
Oh no, no. You guys all love The Shining, right? I don't know if there any. I'd be welcome criticism.
I watch it once a year. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Really like Shining. I don't think I watch it once a year, but I do like it.
Yeah,
I was the same as you, Ben. I was shown it probably. I think I was 8 years old when I watched it, but I don't think. Yeah, my dad just did not like. He just let me watch everything. But I got to see the entire naked woman sing.
Oh, really?
I remember, but like it just ingrained onto my retinas. That the horror of that scene for like a good portion of my childhood. But can we say like, horror movies? I think it's an age thing as well. I really think like I'm not condoning this, but I really do think horror movies work best when you're a kid. Because like you believe, like you're a dumb kid and everything you're watching you kind of believe to be reality and don't really question the strings and the method behind it and everything, and you're just like, shit, this is awful, and like if I go to bed tonight I might end up like these characters. So it's a double-edged sword, but watching
I love that.
I think it's I wish I could still feel the same way.
It sort of reminds me that I think at one point, like horror films, sort of not just the creating of horror films, but the act of viewing them was like an act of subversion, and I miss that about horror films. I think when we were kids,
like doing it was something you shouldn't be doing. Like was like, this is like me putting my VHS into the machine when I was like 8 years old. Like, am I doing something that's going to be like, am I going to die? I know that's such an extreme thing, but I'm like, when you're that age, it's just like your imagination just runs wild. Well, certainly mine did anyway. But it feels like you were the same band with The Shining.
Yeah, I think going back to that bathtub scene, it is probably one of the most terrifying things I like when I finally did watch it, like a few years later. It was just one of the most terrifying things I had ever seen. And it's the build-up that really, really does it for me. That slow kind of violin. And it's one of the first uses of a Steadicam. So I imagine audiences in 1980 would have been like, holy shit, this is... Because it glides. There's no personality to the camera anymore. It's just gliding towards his bathtub. And although obviously,
she just peers the curtain back with her fingers. Yeah,
and yet, like, even though obviously Jack Nicholson, the idea is that he's getting seduced by her, the audience really isn't. Like, you already know that there's nothing sexual is about to happen here. You know something horrifying.
He's like, this is my lucky day.
Yeah, he's like, quid's in. We're just like, Jack, mate, you're fucked. You are fucked. Yeah, and then like to the point where it's a surprise when you see him later, seemingly fine. It's just and that cackling. There's something about the cackling when she's sort of walking towards him, and the look of terror on his face is unmatched. Can never be done again. Now, there we go. There's my 3, The Shining, to cap it off. Yeah.
Go on, Danny. Bring it home, baby.
I'm going to bring it home with... I kind of thought both of my choices are sort of a bit older. I thought I'd pick a more contemporary film to finish with. So I chose Ty West's X.
Ooh. Okay.
And I picked it because I genuinely believe it to be... In terms of like modern horror films, I know there's a lot of good ones that I probably need to watch or revisit, but I think it's up there with one of the best sort of modern horror films that I've seen in such a long time. And I missed the release of it. I didn't really know a lot about it until Pearl was coming out, and I thought, oh, that looks good. And then I realized there was a predecessor, and I kind of like did some research. I thought, oh, that sounds good. So I just bought it on a whim and watched it, and I just absolutely loved it. I just thought it was excellent. I think the reason I love it so much is because, I think a lot of slashers, particularly, obviously a lot of slashers are indebted to Wes Craven, but I think the narrative trope of a self-aware slasher, the sort of self-awareness as a tool to sort of critique the inner workings of the movie industry or the nature of the genre, which obviously, Wes Craven with New Nightmare. She like Wes Craven in like really sort of like negligee. Yeah.
Especially Scream.
Like exactly Scream and New Nightmare. Like, he pioneered that sort of self-aware tone that obviously is brilliant when done right. But I think a lot of slashers sort of felt the need to continue to do that. And particularly, obviously, the sort of more recent Scream films, even though I don't actually dislike them, I quite enjoy them. But, they're continuing that trend.
Yeah.
And it's sort of very tired. What I liked so much about X was that it kind of stuck quite true to the formula of a slasher. And instead of using self-awareness, it kind of, it allowed the sort of the era to really speak for the film in terms of, and the sort of socio-cultural schisms at the time, and particularly the sort of battle between hippie culture, the youth, and the elderly, and about the sort of the beliefs and misconceptions and the sort of lies that both generation tells themselves to justify their sort of frustration or outright anger at what had become essentially like an opposing side in this sort of cultural war. And I think West does such a good job of playing with that and weaving it into the fabric of the movie. And the way he sort of subverts those expectations, particularly with the sort of... You've all seen it, I assume.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly in the sex scene between the elderly couple. Like, given what's happened in that film or preceded in that film, it's quite sort of strangely quite
scene,
sweet and beautiful. And
it's
you're right, it is sad.
Yeah.
And what I love so much about that scene is that it's kind of like, and it's sort of representative more broadly of Pearl, the older woman's character more broadly, is that obviously she has these desires, that she still wants to be beautiful. She still has a sex drive. She wants to be satisfied sexually, which, and this idea that I think the young people have and that what they map onto the elderly generation is that they're just these sort of like sexless, God-fearing sort of husks that just have no, they can't express anything other than that, and they hate anything new. And it's, it's a real, I don't know, I thought it was a really interesting way to subvert that in a way that was really quite sort of meaningful. And then around all of that, you've just got, the classic setting. Obviously, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is borrowed liberally. The sort of the feel of the film, the tone, the color palette.
Yeah.
No,
but it doesn't feel like an imitation at all. It feels really like you can feel the grime and dirt of the era, and via the cinematography. It feels, a lot of modern films do try to replicate an era, and they feel still sheeny and digital.
agree.
And this, I think, out of all three films, I think West achieved that.
Yeah,
best,
exactly. And I was
100%.
sort of, what you're saying is totally right, and I was kind of disappointed by Maxine in the sense that it didn't quite feel like 80s, whereas
I think the first 20 minutes did, and then it just sort of like forgot it was doing the thing and just became a generic like film.
Such
afterwards.
a shame, that film, because I put so much. I really liked Pearl as well, by the way, but I just think X for me is the standout film of the trilogy, and I think you're right, Chris, in the sense that it really immerses itself in the time, and not in a way that is sort of cheap or still through the lens of like contemporary filmmaking techniques or approaches. I think there's a real considered approach to the influences and also the themes and the sort of historical issues of the time, which all sort of create, I think, one of the best horror films of certainly slashers of the last sort of 5 or 10 years. I absolutely love it. I can't speak highly enough of it. And I always, look for opportunities to sort of recommend it to people. It's one of those films for me that I just love.
Yeah, what a fun like novelty at the beginning of that film to open up with the deceased bodies of the of what's already happened at this house, like all the dead bodies already scattered around, and then seeing how we get to that, and like that's such a risk. And I remember that really working for me, and like really was a really good pull into the story. See, okay, how do we get here? Really, really fun.
It was funny because I did watch Texas Chainsaw Massacre this week for the first time because I hadn't actually seen it before, because I thought it was going to be one of your films, Danny. But it was one of the things I was thinking throughout it. I was going like, oh, okay, because I'd heard that X had been like quite heavily influenced by Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but I was like, oh yeah, Next nails the vibe of this kind of like, again, it's that atmosphere thing, isn't it? Of just like something weird is going on here, and the grittiness and the griminess, and like it's all a little bit dirty and weird. And it is funny that that X like really does nail that in a way that I haven't seen films do that. So.
Exactly. And I just love the characterization as well. Like even like the young characters who would, I think, posit themselves as like symbols of the sexual revolution and this new dawn, the hippie culture. But even what I really like about the film in that sense is that in the interactions between them, there's that scene with Jenny Ortega's character and her partner, who's the director. He's like directing this porno, and they're sort of like presumably quite well endowed, handsome fellas there. Jenny Ortega sort of like expresses a desire to do a scene with him, and the director really struggles with that, and she does it, and it's just it's sort of like not sort of exposing it is like the sort of like sexual liberation of the time as a sham, but I think there is like some there's a bit of thematic density there in the portrayal of that, and how actually I think a lot of people were swept up by this movement and weren't necessarily in line with it, but didn't want to share like anything ideologically similar to the people and the system that they were against. So maybe they just felt they had to sort of toe the line, sort of, to fit in or to facilitate their frustrations with other things or their creative ambitions or whatever. But I just think it's interesting that the film, it plays with those expectations, commonly held expectations held by both sides of that spectrum, and works with them really well and messes around with them and sort of, mixes it all up, and it makes it all the more nuanced. It's not relying on caricature only. It does, but only to sort of then subvert it, not just sort of rigidly stick to it, which a lot of horror films do and can do brilliantly. But yeah, I just love it for that reason. And of course, the death sequences too are fantastic and sufficiently gruesome. My favorite is the pitchfork through the farmhouse.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I quite like the whole sequence with the car at the end.
Yeah.
That really stuck with me at the end of X. That's what I chiefly remember it for. I need to rewatch it actually. It's one of those films I rented on Amazon Prime, so I only owned it for about 48 hours. And I preferred it to Pearl actually. I think Pearl for me was more forgettable. Weirdly, I remember X a lot more, and I remember I think X were setting it in the in that era as opposed to Pearl, which is like the
just
19
post First World War, isn't it? Yeah, I think it's like even before 20s.
Post-World War,
it's like 1918, 1919.
Yeah, because her husband is returning from the First World War, isn't he? Near the end of the film, yeah.
That's right, yeah. And then David Corenswet shows up as well. He's the projectionist, isn't he?
Yes.
But there's something about the 20s which I think is harder to replicate on film without doing it, doing the full kind of black and white, scratchy pillar box style, which, to be fair, probably would not have worked in Pearl's favour, but it felt more digital than X for that reason. I think they didn't lean in as much to that style, although they did attempt it, especially with the title sequence. But yeah, no, I agree. I think X is definitely the strongest of the three.
Yeah, it's almost as if for Pearl in particular, it was more of a showcase of like Mia Goth going off the handle with her performance, and obviously she gets to be really playful in X in terms of playing two different characters and go with that, but it's a lot more, I think, subtle in its kind of craziness, whereas I think she just dials it up to 11 in Pearl, and then and then Maxine's its own thing again. Maybe
I really like Pearl though still.
Oh yeah, no, I do.
Yeah, no, I definitely.
I think in defense of Pearl's sort of maybe aesthetic shortcomings, I think you could argue that the sort of more flamboyant nature of the film is more representative of that era of cinema when it was more of a necessity to be more flamboyant and expressive and over the top, but to convey things that the limitations of the technology at the time wouldn't allow. And I think that worked really well. Like the fact it was like a musical and all that kind of stuff, I thought that kind of worked in its favour. Yes. And I do really like the film. I think perhaps, maybe didn't make that clear, but like I love X. I think X is definitely my favourite, but I do really love Pearl. I still think it's a great addition to that trilogy. It's just a shame that Maxine fell so flat.
We probably have more of a nostalgia for the time setting that X is set in as well, because we've probably seen more films from that era and have an idea of what, visually it looks like. And then obviously, like you mentioned, Ben, like, Pearl is, still a color film and it looks kind of digital, and that's not what we kind of think of the 20s as. Like, it's very much like black and white and silent and all that kind of stuff.
Mono sound mixes, right?
Yeah.
Like the Lighthouse. They should have maybe attempted at least a few sequences like more akin to the Lighthouse. I don't know. Yeah.
Maybe my own history is skewed by like what film was like during that time.
That's an interesting point. I remember we talked about it, Ben, before, but the idea, I think this might lead into why maybe we wouldn't necessarily have sold on Pearl aesthetically, is that because of the way we take culture on, like, I don't know about you guys, when I think about the 1980s, I think about it through the grain of the films that were made in that period, or the 70s. Like, because of that's the only way you can think about that culture. It's like, because your only window into it is the films that were made at the time, or the TV or the music or whatever. And I think you're right, Alex, in saying that obviously we have far more reverence for that period because it's probably more recent. The technology was a bit more sophisticated. And also those films are more readily available. Like, it's harder to find the works of like Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton. After that, you're sort of lost, really. It's quite difficult to source the material unless, obviously the Blu-ray collector stuff, they do quite a lot of those films, but even still, it's not easy. So I think you're right, Alex, that we are sort of treated to so much more stuff from the 70s, 80s, etc., than we are the early era. So it makes it harder to identify with it or relate to it.
It's almost like, if you think of anything historical, typically the cinematography is much more painterly. It looks like paintings. There's no handheld shots in Gladiator, for example. It's like,
because they're all based on a physical reference in a museum or a gallery or something like that, right?
Yeah, they're all very kind of their attention is very much diverted towards composition, because obviously we have nothing but paintings to reference. Yeah, exactly. It is interesting. How our perception of an era is informed by the media that was generated around that time. But I mean, what else do we have to go by, I suppose, other than novels, I suppose.
Even then, though, it's really hard. Like, do you see like footage of like people from like the Victorian era or something? These sort of obviously they are humans, but they don't look human. I don't know what it is. It's really weird. Like,
yeah,
the acting style, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's something about the style of acting, I think, that just kind of makes you think, like, this is not real. These aren't real people.
They're quite often all posing for the camera because cameras were so much more interesting back then. So they're all looking at the camera, smiling.
They all just look like miserable, usually.
Yeah. And their teeth are all fucked as well because they're
6 days a week to do that.
They shall not grow old except for their teeth, which are already old. Yeah,
brilliant. Nice one, Danny. Nice one. Shall we move on to the next segment of the show? I asked our lovely listeners to ask us some kind of Halloween themed questions for our Halloween special. So thanks, Mum. I've got a few of these here. So I thought we'll answer a few of these and hopefully get our kind of our Halloween brains going. So here we have a question: a horror film that you'd like to see have a prequel or sequel if it doesn't have one already. So, are there any kind of standalone in the modern days? Standalone horror films are pretty unique. If anything is successful, it gets a million remakes and sequels and prequels and stuff. But is there anything out there that you think deserves maybe another
That's
look?
a great question. I'm really, because even in the 70s and 80s, the sequels really were the name of the game, weren't they? Especially with horror films.
Definitely.
I have an answer actually. If
go for it,
if that's okay. Just quickly. I think Event Horizon deserves like a sequel or a prequel.
That is such a good idea, actually. Yeah.
I really love that film.
And prequel, I'd say.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to explore that hellscape a little bit more that they introduced. I feel like it will look like Doom or something. You know, I just want to see more of that because you only see that bloke with his eyes are in his hands and he's like saying Latin. I don't know. I want to see more of that. Yeah, that's mine.
Nice. I think if I don't know if I've got like a sequel or a prequel, but if I was to have somebody do a remake, just because I'd like to see what a kind of more contemporary modern version of this would be. Have you guys seen Brian De Palma's Sisters?
Yeah.
About the conjoined twins.
Yes,
I really love that film. I think it's so wacky and weird, but like schlocky in the best way.
Oh, that's Brian De Palma in it, in a nutshell.
Exactly. And I just think like, I don't want to say a remake, I don't want to see a remake just to kind of take away from the original or anything like that, because the original holds up, I think. But it'd be interesting to see kind of like a modern, contemporary look at that. And maybe, if somebody can still make it in a kind of fun, schlocky way. Like, what's his name who did like The Conjuring and James Wan. Like he is very fun with his horror films. Like I love Malignant. I think Malignant's an excellent horror film, or like an excellent fun horror film. I just love that whole film. I feel like he would be able to take something
boss fight at the end of that film. Yeah.
I think he'd be able to take something like Sisters and maybe put a fun new twist on it. But I know that's not a prequel or a sequel, so sorry if I've twisted the question.
No. Could you imagine, have you seen Dressed to Kill? That's another Brian De Palma film. I don't want to sort of spoil, I can't talk about it because to make the joke would spoil the film, but that's another great Brian De Palma horror film. I would recommend for more reasons than one.
Oh no, Danny, I have seen Dressed to Kill. I actually watched it with yes, that was Michael.
Yeah.
Because me and Alex were both listening to the Karina Longworth series, and I was so intrigued by that film. But that film has its problems. But I remember it definitely. But that's a good show. It's a good show.
Yeah, I just had a look. I haven't seen it, and I probably should.
It's definitely.
It's good. It's still good.
It's great. It's really great. But yeah, I think I think it would be a film that, and I don't mean this in a sort of critical, like anti-woke way, because I don't prescribe to that belief system at all. But I do think this is one of those films that would genuinely struggle to be made now.
Right. Okay.
I'm not being critical about the current state of now. And when I say that, I just think because of what the film is and what it is. But yeah,
that probably is a bit that's a little bit Brian De Palma anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's his bread and butter, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's I'm really trying to think.
I don't know if you carry on with the whole like predator prey thing. I don't know, stick him on the Titanic this time and see how he gets on with high society or something.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah, there are a lot of films like that, isn't there? Where you just like, just stick that person somewhere weird and then just, like, see it from that angle. But they are making like another Predator film, aren't they?
Tracking Boats. He's got two, isn't he? He's got two, apparently. Yeah, he's got two.
I heard there was like one filmed in surprise or in surprise, in secret or something like that. So
surprise!
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see where they chuck the Predator next. So yeah, it's
funny because I think, and I don't want to sort of take the question too far, but I do. I think because I'm so fatigued with prequels and sequels that I sort of there's some films that I would just say for the sake of it. Something like, I know you'll hate this, Ben, but
28 years later,
American Werewolf in London. Do you know what I mean? Like,
oh yeah, okay.
Oh yeah.
Like I'm so sort of fatigued by the sort of prequels and sequels that I just sort of don't want any of those films that I love to have when anything like that happen to them. But there's always a chance they could be good though. So maybe American Werewolf in London would be.
Well, they almost had Max Landis.
Max Landis nearly did it, yeah.
Yeah. Until he got found out to be problematic.
Yeah.
Person. So, he was on board because obviously he's the son of John Landis. So,
how close was that? Was it an actual sequel? Was it? I knew there was something.
Yeah.
Oh shit!
It was in pre-production, I think. But I mean, I think with that film, the argument would always be just chuck the original on again because it stands the test of time.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it doesn't. I mean, the law that it introduces is an open and shut case. So I think, although it would be interesting, it might be great. I routinely have a sort of fantasy about making a sequel to American Werewolf in London and having it be brilliant.
American Werewolf in Skegness.
Yeah.
What about Dog Soldiers? That'd be a good one.
Oh, so good.
I agreed.
Because I love the first one.
That's a good shout.
And I think it's excellent, but I wouldn't be as butthurt if a prequel or sequel was made that was shit. Do you know what I mean? Like, I could still enjoy it.
That movie was so cheap and like nasty looking that it would, I don't know, you can't really replicate something like that. No. I love early Neil Marshall.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if he'll ever get back to that sort of level of greatness that he had when he had limitations. I think that and Descent are just like top tier British horror
They're
films.
brilliant.
Like,
he could have been like a real horror fucking, I think if he'd stayed on that trajectory, I think he could have been, fantastic. It seems to happen with English directors. They start like Ben Wheatley. He's another.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. There's a guy who directed a film called Triangle. The same thing happened to him. He did a couple of really fantastic horror films, and then I think one of them didn't work very well and didn't chime with audiences. He didn't get another chance, and he's still working. But the films are
it's not vet, is it?
To DVD. Well,
Christopher Smith.
That's it. Yeah.
He recently did oh no, he didn't. It was 10 years ago, but he did the Jim Broadbent Rafe Spall Santa movie, Get Santa. So yeah,
right.
He did he did Severance.
Yeah, man.
I haven't seen that movie in years. I remember that. It was one of those
Danny Dyer,
Danny Dyer movies. Yeah.
Triangle's excellent. It's a great, creepy little sort of story. An abandoned boat. What more can you ask for?
Aye.
Yeah, they are. My wish is getting granted with one of these because I always wanted there to be a 28 years later, and now there is going to be one. So
it was originally going to be like 28 months later back in the day, wasn't it? And obviously that time
waited too long. Yeah.
And they filmed 2 films back to back as well with that again. And I know we just spoke about the new Predator films being 2 films.
Yeah,
but I'm pretty sure I just read that the new 28 years later they've filmed 2 films.
Yeah, so one of them is directed by Danny Boyle and the other one is Nia DaCosta.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, from Candyman fame. Yeah.
Candyman, yeah.
Which is a great film as well. That's a great film.
I haven't actually seen it.
Not the the new one I didn't love as much, but the original.
The original.
The original. Yeah. I love the original. Tony Todd. Yeah. I haven't seen the remake, but didn't she do like Miss Marvel or something after that, or the Marvels? That's Nia DaCosta.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There's something a bit.
Yeah,
I don't know. Like I mean, we're straying way off. This question's really opened a far-reaching discussion.
Yeah.
But those kind of like being like a studio director for hire in the traditional sense didn't used to be such a problem for me. But I think because filmmaking now, particularly mainstream filmmaking, is so dependent on studio interference and they sculpt very much. I don't know. Maybe I'm being a bit cynical, but I'm just a bit.
I think she's still like a filmmaker that has a lot of untapped promise still. Like I'm still like waiting for the movie from her that really works. Like I think it can still happen.
Fair play.
Yeah, you can't judge a director by their Marvel films these days. I don't.
That's also fair. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, maybe I'm being a bit harsh.
Because the likelihood is they had little to do with it.
They're just Marvel. Kevin Feige just goes, "Cheers for the footage. Well, you don't need to edit it. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it." Yeah. I can stick around. No. We've already booked your train.
Train.
Don't worry about the reshoots. We'll figure them out.
Here's a Miss Marvel lunchbox on your way.
Right, we've got a lot of questions still to get for you, Alex. Do you want to? Give us our next one.
Yep. So this one is, what is the weirdest fear a horror movie is based on? Though I guess we could also twist it to be like, what's the weirdest horror film you've seen? Because that's one of the things about the genre, I think, is that because they're usually quite low budget films and a lot of directors start there, you do get to see a lot of directors play around with the genre and really make some kind of quite wacky stuff. So I don't know if there's a particular kind of weird horror film that you have some love for.
I mean, we were talking about this on our own podcast, but more broadly, the Nightmare on Elm Street sequel was a batty, like really, really, really crazy at points. Even like the sixth one, I quite like because it has
forget the sixth one.
Oh yeah, it's Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare. At one point, Peter Jackson was going to direct it, mate. I mean, those sequels are all ridiculous. We were talking at length the other day about Dream Warriors, which we both think is genuinely excellent. But I mean, they don't tap into a fear that's particularly strange, though. I mean, it is just the fear of losing control when you're asleep, I suppose, and being the kind of unpredictable nature of dreams. Yeah, it's a good question.
I'm gonna take the question quite literally with specific fear. I think that on a serious note, I think that a common through line in pretty much every Stephen King adaptation, where like kids or young people are the central driving force of the plot. I think that fear is the fear of like not being able to confide in or trust your loved ones. Like movies like It or The Shining, and then even like the sequel, The Shining, Doctor Sleep, are like so uncomfortable to watch because the idea of a child's security or someone that they can find shelter in to defeat a monster or some entity or whatever the movie's about should be the sanctity of their own parents. But more often than not in those films, the parents are dismissive of their children, or sometimes they are actually just the villains, or they're just as bad as what they're trying to fight. So I find that prospect quite scary.
Yeah, that's a really good.
The fear of like just isolation, and especially when you're a kid, the less power they have, and they can only trust themselves and their friends in those moments. So that the stakes become higher. So I think that's
really great. Actually, thinking about the idea of. I think you're sort of actively encouraged, aren't you, to think that your family is like the most important thing. And it's almost inconceivable, yet entirely realistic that you won't get on with your family. And I think a lot of people struggle with that, particularly as there's such an overwhelming pressure to be close to your family and to feel sort of like similar to them in almost every way because you're blood. That's often the thing, isn't it? Your blood. It's very old fashioned and probably I don't know if it does. It feels like it comes from like a very sort of, it's very rooted in our history and our development that you should be together and close. And the idea that you would just look at them and think, I don't really, well, that fussed. That's actually that. That's but that,
I'm not love.
But you know what I mean? That's like a terrifying idea.
of course,
particularly
if you're surrounded by people that don't have those concerns or feelings, that alienates you even more, which is fucking Yeah, I can imagine that would be.
Well, you guys had a lot more interesting answers to this film or to this question, because I was just like, I watched a film called Killer Sofa once, and I think that was weird because it was about a killer sofa. So nothing intellectual to add to this.
I also want to further go forward. I remember, I've not seen it. My friends talk about a film called Bad Biology, which is about a sentient killer penis.
Adding to the watch list.
How does the penis get
sort of snakes around? I think perhaps use the sort of bollocks as like a sort of platform, and then the sort of end to sort of drag itself.
Like a worm. Yeah.
Did it inspire Beau is Afraid?
I was just about to mention Beau is Afraid. It really reminded me.
I would be surprised. And also a film that I remember would staying with genitals. Teeth.
Teeth. Yeah. I quite like Teeth.
Yeah,
there's some really shit visual effects in that film. There's a shot
I watched before puberty.
Yeah. There's a shot of like a power station which is behind the person's house that looks really, really bad. Like the visual effects are actually so naff in that moment, it almost ruined it. But it's a good, as a film, it kind of it's a precursor to It Follows, maybe, and also maybe comes after Life Force, even, you could argue.
Yeah,
in that kind of a sort of sexual health element of horror.
Well,
films.
Sex is such a pivotal thing in horror, isn't it? There's there's so much to unpick there, just particularly gender representations and all that sort of stuff. But I guess the film is interesting in that sense, even if it does have a sort of shit special effects for the power station.
I'm sorry, I don't know why that popped into my head.
Sorry to point it out, but I think the idea of that. I mean, I can't really remember being that sort of invested thematically in it. I just, as a teenage boy, obviously, just grabbing my private area and just wanting to reassure it. I wasn't like holding it for any other reason.
I want to add one more film to this list briefly, just in terms of the weirdest fear being represented in a film: The Happening. And it's the wind, but not even a strong wind, not like a hurricane, a small wind, like a very kind of sort of gentle breeze being the driving force behind the characters running away from stuff. That's baffling to me. I mean, that film gets loads of attention still to this day, just because of how unusual and unhinged it is. The Happening. That's probably going to be my ultimate answer.
Nice. I have a question here from friend of both our podcasts, though he's been on yours a few times, Lee. Good old Lee Markham. So he said, do you feel like this is a good era for horror films? And then he's prefaced that by saying 2010s definitely was, 2000s very bad. So,
okay. Yeah.
I personally think we're in a really good spot for horror films right now. But I can't really remember the 2000s that much in terms of horror films, because I don't think I got into the genre more until I was a little bit older. But I definitely feel, like I was saying earlier, like it does seem to be like a stomping ground for like new directors to kind of really play with like, this is what I can do, because it's like a nice low budget but entertaining genre to start in. But I do think we're also seeing like some really quite contemporary, interesting films come out of the genre. Obviously, we spoke about Beau is Afraid, but like Ari Aster doing Midsommar and Hereditary. For me, particularly Midsommar, I really loved that film, and like was one of those films that really got under my skin and like truly did actually scare me, despite the fact that I don't really get scared by films anymore. But there was just something so uneasy and queasy about that film that one kind of got me a bit. But I think we're in a good era. What about
interesting, like how people like him, like Astor and Robert Eggers, had like amassed such a strong cult following, like in the space of 2 to 3 films. It's like so interesting to me. Like I don't feel like that would have happened 20 or 30 years ago.
Maybe it's like a sort of a yearning for to sort of
authorship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think because I don't know. But I feel like the modern landscape of cinema, it's quite it's quite stifling, isn't it? You aren't really spoiled for choice. And I think companies like A24 and that have come along and they've offered that choice. And they've offered choice not just in the sense that, if you don't fancy superhero films or remakes, but they've also offered like a sort of artistic choice and a freedom on the part of the filmmakers to really ply their trade in a way that perhaps isn't as afforded to filmmakers, certainly in mainstream filmmaking, and especially in the digital age, where I think studios are a lot more guarded about giving vast sums of money to filmmakers to realize whatever project or dream they have. But yeah, that's maybe. I mean, I'm not sort of like nailing myself to that entirely, but I feel like that might be an element of it, in the sense that we're getting a lot more of those kinds of films as almost like a sort of a response to the sort of the way the industry is and the way it's still sort of reeling from streaming and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think also with regards to Lee's comment about the 2000s being a bad time for horror, I think you have to look at what technology was available at the time to filmmakers who wanted to kind of maybe bring horror films into a more expensive realm. So I'm thinking like immediately when I think of the 2000s with regards to horror, it's like Resident Evil and like Q, which will have really quite like naff looking visual effects that don't hold up, because horror films, obviously the budget generally is still pretty low. And then obviously by the time you get to the 2010s, though, that kind of technology becomes invisible quite a lot of the time, where you could probably half of all the shots in a film might be enhanced in some fashion by some kind of visual trickery. So yeah, it's funny. I just remember the 2000s for that kind of pretty uncomfortably naff looking visual effects stuff.
Even major studios did occasionally birth the odd, good anomaly. Like the first, Final Destination, it's not a masterpiece, but they're kind of fun.
I like that first one
for sure.
Where I don't feel like major studios have really any major impact on making us scared anymore. I think that trade solely belongs to the independent sector of filmmaking now. Yeah. Where so I feel like once it was shared between the two.
Yeah, I think Saw is the only kind of franchise that they keep trying to reinvigorate, don't they? Like,
but the last Saw movie ripped. I thought that was
really.
Great. I think it was the best Saw movie.
Is that the one set in Mexico or something?
Yeah, it's surprisingly really.
Have you not seen it then?
I've not seen it. No, I've
it's so good.
No, I must say, like, I do have a bit of love for the Saw films, because they were like one of those kind of franchise of films that I remember, like, do you remember like the iPod Nanos and stuff like that? I used to put films on those and like watch them under the bed covers. And for some reason, the Saw films were a franchise of films I watched. I've always had a bit of a sweet spot for them. They just I just remember watching them like properly tucked into my bed covers.
That's a really nice little memory.
Watching on an iPod Nano. And also, can I just say, because I know a lot, and this is on a tangent here, a lot of filmmakers say like you have to watch things on the big screen and stuff like that. My favorite film is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. I first saw that film on an iPod Nano.
Oh, wow. I love that.
Still my favorite film. I have now only seen it on TV. Would love to see that one in the cinema, actually.
With regards to like watching films on a tiny, tiny little screen, I've got I basically what happened to me in, I think it was like year 9 or something. There was this girl who I really fancied, and we were doing some kind of project together for one of the classes. Classic. And it was like lightning in a bottle for me. I was like, yes, we have to spend time with each other. And it was one of the only times that I'd actually managed to kind of pluck up the courage to talk to her like a normal human being, as opposed to just kind of like blindly sort of, I don't know, just kind of pining after her. And my friend came up to me with this PSP and shoved it into my face when I was like mid-sentence. And what was on the screen was Star Wars Episode 3: Revenge of the Sith, and it was the General Grievous fight, and that was that. That was the conversation between me and this girl over. Yeah, she was just like,
she changed groups.
Maybe not. No, she didn't. But we didn't really collaborate that much after that point.
It became very perfunctory after that.
The boy knows what he likes.
He was just like, "Oh, Ben will love it." Oh, no, man. Not the right time. Unbelievable. Anyway, sorry, that big tangent, but yeah.
My fault as well. All good. So the next question is, what do you think the most underrated horror film is?
I'm going to say we talked about this in our most recent episode, but I'm going to say Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, I think would be
okay,
criminally underrated. It's just in the shadow of the first one, which is obviously the best one. But the third one is really great. It sort of takes the themes, the sort of horror within American suburbia, the sort of disconnect between the old and the young, the hidden secrets, and the sort of familial disconnection that we talked about before, what you were saying, Chris, in the sort of relation to Stephen King. It takes all of that, it takes it away from suburbia and puts it in the American sort of psychiatric wards.
Oh, okay.
And
it's like Exorcist takes its sequels into psychiatric.
Yeah. That's funny. I'd not thought about that. But yeah, you're right. It's like, it just seems like a natural progression. I think it's particularly impactful in the case of Dream Warriors. It's sort of like, the attempt to sort of hide those sort of imperfect things that, in the pursuit of greatness that tend to be ignored or avoided. And obviously the psychiatric hospital is a sort of very obvious metaphor for that, I think, but a very effective one. And it also has some great moments in terms of the use of special effects. Chuck Russell, the director, steady hands. He didn't really do a great deal. He made Eraser, and I like Eraser. So, but I just think, I think that's an underrated one because people perhaps would write it off on the basis that the second one isn't very good. And most horror sequels, particularly in that time, were pretty naff. So
yeah. That's a good one. A good example of a threequel being good as well, which is even more unusual.
Yeah, true.
Why do you see these sequels? I always watch I've seen the first Friday the 13th, I've seen the first Nightmare on Elm Street, but I just never follow through, and I feel like they'd be a good time. They're not to be dismissed always. Yeah.
The Nightmare sequels are great.
I know the Friday the 13th is known for being naff from beginning to end, so I'm not sure if I'll invest myself into those something 15 films, but Nightmare interests me. Yeah.
You've got to get the Blu-ray box sets. That's where you really get the treasure trove.
I have £300 lying around.
That's true. Yeah, I know. Yeah. I know. Yeah, I don't either. I mean, crippling debt. And on the subject of sequels, sorry, I know but I must say, because it's in my mind, Hellraiser 4.
We've been watching the Hellraisers. They're good.
Yeah.
Really good.
They're great.
Could you imagine if you set Hellraiser in the Victorian era? That'd be interesting.
That would be interesting.
That would work. It just fits. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. It's not great, but it's mad. It's set in space.
There's a vibe about Clive Barker, which I think is really unique, and you can see it in Candyman as well. It's like fleshy. I can't describe it.
The blood in Hellraiser is some of the best blood in a horror film, I think. It's so thick.
I need to watch them. I've not seen the Hellraiser films.
Oh, they're great.
I really enjoyed it. I've been watching them around yours, Danny. They're really good. And you gave me the Blu-ray recently as well. It's just very nice.
Oh, I don't know if it is Hellraiser 4, actually. Yeah, I did. Shit, which one is it? Is it 4? Where's the one set in space? Yes, it is.
Of course.
Yeah.
You got Jason X as well.
Hellraiser 4 is set in space, which is weird because the other ones aren't. And there's also a time traveling narrative. Adam Scott's in it as well, weirdly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
So, there we go.
I'm going to shout out one film as well. I think I have a feeling at least one of you have seen this before. Have any of you seen Carnival of Souls?
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like that's a very underrated film. It's very, very experimental film from '62, directed by Hank Harvey, which was severely constrained by its limitations of its budget. But all of the vocals in the film are dubbed over, and it even then it's not the most polished. But even that doesn't get in the way of how unique and special that film is. The story, it surrounds a young woman called Mary who survives a car accident, and then she relocates to a new town where she's completely out of sync with the locals, and at the same time is drawn to this very far off abandoned carnival that lurks in the outskirts of town. But what makes it so special is you could say all the typical things that a film fan should say, like in terms of its like using existing locations and the whole way the film in the 1960s American version of it's almost like an American version of a German expressionist film. But the truth is, I think the magic of Carnival of Souls is it's like split second images that sort of burn themselves into the back of your brain. Like, when you see something that's so surreal and eerie in your everyday life, like very, very occasionally, and you keep it to yourself. And it's like you're not sure if you remembered it or if you just made it up. And that image just reoccurs in your mind like all of your life. It's kind of like that. So yeah, I didn't stay for the plot, but I stayed for all like the haunting, ghoulish faces randomly popping up on screen and that creepy organ music and that disgustingly demonic looking carnival in the background when she's driving down the road. That's such a cool movie. Like, I bought it as well because
that's a great suggestion, man. I've not thought about that film for such a long time, but it's a belter. It's very good.
I'd love to give that a go. That sounds really interesting. Yeah, that'll be.
It's not even like it's like 78 minutes long. Like it's really short, but it's just like you don't forget. You watch it once and you won't forget it.
It's on Criterion, I believe.
Is it?
A beautiful poster. Like the original poster is so garish. It looks like a carnival poster from like the 20s or something like that.
Yeah.
Like rain splattered over it and it got all the colors washed down. It's like it perfectly evokes what that experience is like. But yeah, it's cool.
So I've got a question here. What is the kind of most iconic horror theme tune or horror soundtrack?
So many,
and why is it Halloween?
Anything by John Carpenter, isn't it? Although the Exorcist theme's pretty good.
Yes, I was just about to say, I was going to say Nightmare on Elm Street has a pretty good one, I think, as well.
All
the
Jaws,
Suspiria, Goblin,
Prog. Oh yeah, even the new Suspiria.
Oh yeah, Tom York, soundtrack. My hero. Yeah, oh baby.
Yeah, the prog rock soundtrack of Suspiria. Remember when we watched that, Alex, at your house, and we were getting some I think we were pumping up some sofa bed or something like that, and the DVD menu for Suspiria just played the Goblin theme tune in the background for like 20 minutes on a loop, and we were just like, I couldn't forget about it for weeks after that. But yeah, that's awesome, that soundtrack.
God knows, because I've got quite a lot of Giallo films to go through, and it made me realise how great Italian prog rock is.
Those Mario Bava movies and all, brilliant.
I was going to say, I know I keep bringing it up, but the Saw music whenever they do an exposition
so
at the end of the film that explains the whole film. Very, very 2000s. That sounds a little bit like the you wouldn't steal a handbag advert. Like it's got that thing going.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, really intense. Just like 1,200 instruments all going on at the same time. Yeah.
And it's like, let us explain how the whole film works to you in the last 5 minutes. And there's something very joyous about those moments in those films.
Oh, so good.
I quick shout out to the use of Godspeed You Black Emperor in 28 Days Later.
Oh, yeah.
East Hastings. That is
ruined by X Factor and Britain's Got Talent forever and ever, boy.
Oh God, yeah.
They used to use that like every episode of that show.
Such a strange. They must have licensed it to 20th Century Fox, who must have some kind of affiliation with that, with those kind of that particular brand of English television. But man, what a song! Like East Hastings is just, and it's really heavily edited. It's just incredible. That song has sections in it which aren't even in the film that I just love. Not an original soundtrack, but a great song nonetheless.
Still iconic. We actually have one here from Hannah Ben.
Oh,
you're a good wife. You're a good wife. She said, "Why do horror films always struggle to nail the endings?"
Good question, actually. Even though, if I do say so myself.
Do you know what I think it is? I think it is something to do with the fact that horror films, out of all the different genres of films, they're more interested in those middle acts or those early acts and middle acts of like, here's the thrills. Like, we just want to kind of entertain you and scare you and, make you anxious and queasy over all the gore and blood and all this kind of stuff that like, how do you end some of these films sometimes? Like, do you want to subvert the final girl's stereotype, or does everybody die at the end? And then is that too disappointing? Like, I think maybe there's a struggle there of like a mix of optimism and pessimism and kind of wanting to keep audiences on board at the same time.
That's a good idea. I think there's just like, it's such a broad genre where I think there's a lot of different reasons, so there's not really a particular one. But if we're talking about modern films, there's one common thread among the ones I like the most from this era, and that's like Midsommar and The Witch, Pearl, Saint Maud, things like that. They all have an unhappy ending or a bad resolution, like something that solidifies the antagonist, like that they are a threat that's worth being scared of. And I know that doesn't transfer to every horror film, but I think that's interesting because like I feel like films nowadays are like have a more hopeful ending, just kind of, I don't know, just don't have the same punch. I like to see the bad guys win sometimes.
I think I think with that in mind also, there's quite often horror films rely on the villain or the kind of antagonist being shrouded in mystery and darkness, and once that veil is pulled from them and the monster is revealed, get a prime example, like what else is there for the audience once the monster has and obviously there are notable exceptions, but once you've seen it, that the horror is not there anymore. Even films like The Descent suffer from that a little bit. Once you've seen the creatures for long enough, they're not scary anymore, and then you're kind of stuck with the that kind of the ending, which is a genre trope in itself. Is
multiple endings depending which version you're watching. Yeah,
of course. Yeah, in the case of The Descent, I do. I mean, I do think that there's a kind of thing with regards to particularly like monster flicks, which just. It's just kind of there's quite often a third act struggle, which is kind of more veers towards action and away from horror, and it just means the third act is the weakest act in the film as a result of the horror being kind of I don't know what the right phrase would be to describe it, just kind of discarded, I suppose.
It's a lack of control, isn't it? I think it's sort of. I feel like. I think more. I was thinking this the back of The Substance, like
it's a good example.
A good example. I just think of like throwing everything but the kitchen sink at an ending, and I personally, as far as like a collective viewing experience, I enjoyed the ending, but I wasn't sort of satisfied with the ending on a thematic level, personally. And I think that speaks more broadly to a lot of these kind of horror films, particularly ones that have got more satirical intentions. When I think about the sort of, I mean, it's unfair to compare, eras, and particularly films have got like a pretty well established sort of, reverence that's widespread. But a lot of the more sort of perhaps socially aware or thematically dense horror films, as you say, Chris, tend to end on a more sort of sour note, or a lot of them sort of just end on quite a quiet note. And that to me is a far more impactful ending, particularly if your film has more sort of satirical or critical intentions weaved amongst the themes or the murder or whatever. I do think that there seems to be like, I feel like Ari Aster started it, and I sort of kind of celebrated him for that. But I feel like in this sort of Mubi A24 era, it seems to be like this thing where you've got to go big with an ending all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm just not always convinced that that's like the best way to sort of end films, I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that my main kind of criticism of The Substance, even though I do really love that film, was that like I maybe didn't need the ending as much as I was like, I love watching it go all out and throw everything at the wall, literally, I guess, in the sense of The Substance. But there were a few times before that scene where I thought, if you ended there, actually that might have been a better ending to kind of leave you hanging a little bit. But you're right, there is an element of a bit of a slow burn horror that then gets like completely nuts by the end, which production companies or distribution companies like A24 absolutely
and it as a viewing experience, it was great, but I just think it shows, and I don't want to say this is like as if I'm leveling it at the creatives themselves, but I think it shows like a lack of conviction in pacing and tone. I think if you can hold off from that, you might actually end up saying something more meaningful.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, I've not made a film, so I can't criticize too much. And I did love The Substance. But I felt it was at its most impactful in its sort of quieter, more sort of like, quieter body horror moments. That's when it really made me feel sick and really got under my skin, and I really enjoyed it.
Well, I was saying to Alex the other week when we talked about The Substance that I find the most scary part of that film was when she was preparing herself for the night out and couldn't get her makeup right. And that scene was hard to watch.
That's a tough watch.
The whole movie is kind of hard to watch, but that scene really, like, oh my God, everyone can relate to that. Keep going back to the mirror, looking at the clock, and the time is going.
I'm a person who likes to be on time, so that was stressful to watch. I'd like actually really quickly on the sorry, Chris, you go ahead.
No. I was just saying we've all been there. We've all had days where we don't feel like our best, and like that's more relatable than a woman falling out of our back. Even though the themes still run true, and that film was really effective, but that was especially effective scene. Sorry, Ben, go ahead.
No, all good. I just wanted to flip that question on its head and ask you guys one film each. What is an example of a horror film that has a fantastic ending? Mine would be The Blair Witch Project.
Oh, love that film.
Okay. Fucking great ending. Yeah, like really good ending. The best bit of the film.
I think, I know it sounds like a silly one, but whichever the most recent Final Destination was, I love the fact that it kind of tied all the films together and ended on what you thought was like the first optimistic note of the franchise, but then all of a sudden, no, you're actually in the scene from the very first film.
That's 5. Yeah, I watched that like the other week, actually, weirdly. Okay.
Yeah, and there's something very satisfying about that ending. Like I remember watching that and being like, kind of want to applaud it right now. Like that was very, very smartly done. So I don't know. That one just always comes to mind. I don't know why, but I for some reason was pleasantly surprised by that film. But it's been a while. I don't know, Ben. Did it hold up the other week? I don't know.
I wish I'd watched it in 3D because loads of the stuff was like 3D effects. It was there's a lot of that in it. It's pretty shit, but I actually I love the first one. But the Flight 180 is a good plane crash, so cool to end it on that for sure. Yeah.
This could be recency bias, Ben, but we watched The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing recently. And I do love the ending with Keith David, Kurt Russell. Whenever all the shit's happened, they've blown up the big monster at the end, and the whole movie is like it's 50% monster and gore, which is amazing, and it's also 50% paranoia, and that's just the basic conceit. And just to end it on the basic note that like we think we've destroyed the thing. I don't know if you're still it or if I'm still it. Let's just chill out and drink a whiskey and probably die in the snow. That's a really cool ending.
That is a great ending.
It's a good ending.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Broken clock, always right, twice a day. And actually, it's weird because I keep thinking about Final Destination 5. There's a really good scene on a bridge in that as well. The Final Destination is all about the kills, isn't it? So I guess like they those moments are great in it because they're just a lot of fun. So sorry to Alex to sort of say it was shit. I feel a bit bad now.
Oh no, you're all good. It's been a while. I don't remember them being like, oh my God, I've never seen a film like this before. But I just remember being quite swept up in that final.
Is that the one where the guy keeps trying to hang himself and like to cheat death, and then they like break in the house and the rope breaks on him, and he's like, I've been trying to kill myself 10 times today, and it just that's so funny.
That might have been another one. I don't remember that.
I'm not as au fait with them actually, but I need to get. I remember I have seen the first one, but years ago. I need to give them a go.
Mm-hmm. They're making another one, I believe.
Are they?
Yeah.
They I know what you did in Victorian England.
Yeah.
So
I believe, if I'm right, and I read this correctly, that the new directors of the film pitched the film on a like a Zoom call because it was during the pandemic, and they pitched their kind of idea for a new Final Destination film, but pre-recorded it. So like the fan in their apartment dropped and killed them and did all this kind of stuff, and that was how they got the job. Which I thought was like quite a clever way, but also maybe makes you think that maybe you're getting some people involved that
real fans,
that have real fans of the franchises and some love, and maybe that's where it'll get kind of like the Saw treatment of like, oh, the 13th film in the franchise was actually pretty good. Okay, I think we're probably in like final questions. I've kind of answered this one, but like when we were talking about Saw already, but a film that you sneakily watched when you were young, but maybe regretting it because it scared you. Now, I wasn't that young when I watched Saw. I don't regret it either, but I didn't really have much. I don't really have like an experience like that so much, but I don't know about you guys. Did you sneak any horror films in when you were younger?
Ooh.
Well, it was never sneaking because it was always kind of generally accepted.
Yeah, you didn't have strict parents.
The Rain came out, the American version, in 2002, and I would have been 6 or 7 by the time we rented it. So yeah, I think both the visual concept of the girl coming out of the TV was just too much to handle for me at that age. TV scared me for a while after
that. It's funny you say that. I remember one of, I think it was my auntie, when she was like in her like mid-20s when that film came out. She like had to cover her TV. In her bedroom.
The white
wow.
Yeah.
It's a lot of people that impacted a lot of people. The remake of The Ring. I remember having one really effective jump scare, which was the bit where she's found in the cupboard at the beginning, and I watched that when I was like 16, so I was pretty. I don't think I have a film like that, I think I was kind of, like I keep saying, I think I was, that sort of formative moment was semi-ruined by the fact I was sort of allowed to watch some of them and told not to watch the others. I think Wolf Creek maybe I watched when I was a bit too young, because that's a nasty film and that's an unforgiving film, and it isn't actually, I would say, I like it a lot, but I would say it is sort of like, that its content isn't really justified, maybe. So if I were to say any film, it would probably be Wolf Creek, which I bought the same day that I bought Spider-Man 3 on DVD.
My mum would always tell me that like PGs and stuff were like higher rated, I think, just to like get me to go to bed earlier.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I remember telling me, like, do you know like the film like Arachnophobia?
Yeah.
I remember my mum telling me that was like really gory and really horrible. She did the same with Jaws as well, funnily enough. And I remember thinking those films, there was such a thing of like mystique around both of those films that I watched them and was like, oh, they're not that bad.
I mean, Jaws for PG is pretty gnarly. For like, that's like the gnarliest
that's
PG
true.
ever. Like,
yeah, that's true. So yeah, that'd be my sort of embarrassing. The film that scared me the most was E.T. So.
Oh yeah, you talked about E.T. already, yeah. Oh man, I forgot that story.
Yeah.
I feel like so many people share that collective like trauma over E.T. My girlfriend's
weird looking fella. Weird looking fella. I mean, I've managed to put it to bed now, and I actually really love the film.
Oh yeah, it's amazing.
But I honestly, like, all my like mum would have to do, or my nan would do the thing with the finger, and I'd like burst into tears and run out the room. Like, I honestly couldn't handle it. I used to have a reoccurring nightmare about E.T. that dogged my childhood. Like, do you know the bit in E.T. where is it Drew Barrymore?
Yes,
she puts the wig and the makeup on him. That fucking fucked me up.
It's just like a big meme now, right? Yeah.
I know, honestly, like, this dream would always go the same. I'd be with my mum and dad. I was probably about, 7 or 8. And we'd be about to go out for a really fun day out. And they'd leave the house, slam the door in my face, and go, bye, Danny, bye. Like, almost like, we've left you someone to hang out with. And I'd hear scuttling upstairs. And in my old house, like the front door, there was a landing and then stairs straight up. And I turned around and E.T., after having the works done by a young Drew Barrymore, would like scuttle down the stairs and dive at me with like razor sharp teeth. And I'd wake up, like, honestly, like, I could still remember waking up every single time and being
covered in sweat,
totally
inconsolable.
Man.
Yeah.
Spielberg is the king of scary kids films, though. Because I remember there's a scene, the specific scene in that freaks me out the most is when E.T.'s ill, and what's his name is Elliot's also ill because they're like conjoined spiritually now, or whatever, and they're both so pale, and that scene always freaked me out. I really hated that bit. That one messed with me.
Something about the finger as well. That is weird.
It's very long,
weird.
Slimy.
Yeah,
long and slimy.
It's very dry.
yeah.
Is it dry?
It wasn't that big.
Thinking of the wrong finger.
Yeah, depends on the time of day.
Yeah, and if he's ill or not. He sort of reminds me of Weetabix at the end of the film, like dry Weetabix.
Oh dear.
Yeah, no, honestly, that terrified me. Like, yeah.
On that note, then, on the note of the collective response that E.T. is the scariest film of all time, and the best horror film in the world, all that kind of stuff. We shall bring the podcast to a close, but just want to firstly say thank you to you both, Danny and Ben, for
no worries
coming on the podcast. Mm-hmm. It's long awaited. Long awaited your presence on the podcast, and I believe we've mentioned each other a few times.
yeah.
Some kind of pretend feud going on, which I have loved. But yeah, no, honestly, it's great, and I. Even though I have, we have a film podcast, I don't listen to loads of film podcasts, but I do listen to the Cinebois2Cinemen, and that's not just because I know you guys. It is because I really love hearing your conversations on film.
Too,
so
yeah.
I must tell everybody to go, obviously, follow the Cinebois2Cinemen. Give you guys a follow, because I do think it is a really great podcast.
Oh, thanks, man.
That's
likewise.
Cheers. Yeah, Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for joining us for our Halloween special. That has been the episode for this week. If you've enjoyed it, make sure to leave us a 5-star rating or review. We do really appreciate it. And if you'd like to keep up to date with us, make sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at The Film Angle.
We also have a Film Angle playlist. If you want to listen to what we listen to, you can find that in the show notes. Be sure to catch us next week for more cinematic discussions. Goodbye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.